Unfortunately, we don't always have time to uh, memorize and study everything about a particular chapter. So, what I want to do is I want to condense some foundational material that if you grasp this information, you'll be able to memorize and run with things when concerning the tissues and be able to carry this information throughout the rest of your classes. Now, one thing that's key is that tissues are groups of cells working together towards a common goal, right? So if you understand the concept of what a cell is, and that it's a living organism, and that it has a job, right? If you take a group of these cells and put them together, then they create new jobs. Okay. So we have four categories or four careers of cells here when they're working together on a team. There's epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. Now, epithelial tissue is very specific because a lot of what it does is protects and covers things, right? So when you're thinking of epithelial tissue, think the tile on a floor, or think shingles on a roof. Think of a brick wall. It's either covering something or it's protecting something. And when you break down epithelial tissue, you'll find that it always comes in layers, and that it has specific shapes to its cells, and that the intercellular material in between the cells is little to none. So you're talking about basically a bunch of bricks that have different shapes, and they come in layers. If it's one layer of these cells, then it's considered simple. If it's two or more layers, it's considered stratified. And when you start talking about the cell shapes, they're either flat, which is squamous or squamous, they're either cube in shape, which is cuboidal, or they're tall and bulky, like columnar. Now, the thing that you need to take from this is this point right here. Structure defines function. I cannot tell you how important this is to remember throughout your journey in anatomy and physiology. Structure defines function. When you look at the way something is shaped, when you look at the way something is layered, when you look at the way something is positioned in the body, its structure is going to tell you a lot about what it does. So when you start talking about the fact that a cell is flat, then protection really can't be its primary goal. It's one layer, it's simple, and it's flat. No, that's not protection, right? A piece of paper is not going to protect you from shrapnel from an explosion. That's not how it's going to work. So obviously, if it's flat, squamous, and it's only one layer, simple, then that means that its job is to allow passage, or I should say selective passage. So I want to be selective about something that's passing through. It's not letting everything through, but it is being selective and allowing certain things to pass through. If the shape of the bricks are columnar, and it's stratified, it's multiple layers of big, bulky bricks, then obviously its function is to protect. You're trying to keep things out. If you saw me walking down the street with about three or four guys, all around 6'6", 300 pounds, it's obvious that they're not there to, they're not there to play with children on a playground. They are there to protect. They are there to break somebody in half. Um, if you saw me walking down the street with four or five children between the ages of 8 and 5, and we're all, laughing and talking, obviously I'm not on my way to take out a bunch of supervillains because those are children. And so you're looking at the size and things like that. That tells you a lot about the function. So um, keep that in mind when you're looking at epithelial tissue and you're taking exams. Start from the very beginning with epithelial tissues. Like, how do I know that that tissue is epithelial tissue? Well, look at the cells. Are all the cells stacked together like bricks? Then the next thing you want to do is look in between the cells. Is there a lot of intercellular material? Nope. The cells are stacked on top of one another like bricks. Okay. And then how many layers are there? If there's one layer, then it's simple. If there's more than one layer, then it's stratified. Um, and that will tell you a lot about what it actually does. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that once you've figured out its function, and once you've broken down what shape of the cells and how many layers of the cells there are, that will play into its location, right? Um, I would not expect to see simple squamous epithelium located in the stomach, right? Because simple is only one layer and squamous is flat, and that is the least protective layer of epithelial tissue you've got. And your stomach has hydrochloric acid in it, so it's not going to have something that thin that acid can just burn right through. So think of that and keep that in mind when you're talking about location of epithelial tissue. Now, moving right along, um, let's talk about connective tissue. So with connective tissue is totally different from epithelial tissue. Connective tissue likes to connect layers of things to other things. Okay, that's why you use connective tissue in your skin, because your skin comes in layers and it interconnects those layers to other layers of tissue. It also connects one tissue to another. So um, it sounds like it's almost saying the same thing, but we can get into some examples about that in another video. In between structures, you find connective tissue in between other structures. Sometimes connective tissue will act as a cushion to other organs, and then connective tissue has numerous functions, whereas epithelial tissue, pretty much, covers and protects, and it can do a few other things, but most of what it does is protecting and covering things. Most, right? Connective tissue has numerous different functions. You find that as you're learning the different types of connective tissue. And also, connective tissue provides structure to the body. So it's not just there to cover and protect, it's also there to give shape to different organs. It's the whole reason why a spleen is shaped like a spleen or a liver is shaped like a liver. It's because of connective tissue. So, when you're talking about connective tissue, its cells are not basic like this. Like epithelial cells are real basic. It's shapes and layers. The end. Connective tissue cells are not like that. Connective tissue cells are what we refer to as specialized cells. They have specific jobs, right? So fibroblasts, they build protein fibers. Adipocytes, they store fat within the cells and make adipose tissue, right? Um, Osteocytes, they help to manage and maintain the bone tissue. So these cells are very specific. They got specific names, they do specific things, and they don't deviate from those things. Um, they're not generalized. They're very specific in what they do. You don't find them in other parts of the body just hanging around, you know, pediddling around. They have specific jobs. Connective tissue typically has protein fibers in it too. These protein fibers will define the function of that connective tissue as well, because protein fibers, if there's a lot of elastic protein fiber in there, then it's going to make the tissue overall very elastic. It's going to make it very pliable versus collagen. Collagen is not there to make it pliable. Collagen is not there to make it stretch. Collagen is there to resist movement. It's there for strength. Um, Also, intercellular material, also referred to as matrix. Intercellular, in between cellular cells. So intercellular material in between the cells, also referred to as intercellular matrix. The matrix, the content that's surrounding the cells, will also determine a lot of details about the function of a particular connective tissue. So when you're learning the connective tissue and when you're trying to identify connective tissue on a test, you got to identify the cells that's in it, the fibers that's in it, and the stuff that is swimming in. Think of it like a bowl of cereal. All right. If you're looking at a bowl of cereal, um, the individual, the individual units of cereal. Like, I don't know if you're a Fruit Loop person, a Frosted Flake person, or a Cheerios person, or a Fruity Pebbles person. But the Fruity Pebbles would be the specialized cells, and the protein fibers would be random strings or straws placed within your bowl of cereal, and the milk would be the matrix that everything is floating in, right? And that's connective tissue. And so, you can tell a bowl of cereal, you can identify a bowl of cereal by looking at each of the things that's floating in the bowl, right? So the same thing happens with connective tissue. You can't memorize connective tissue and apply what you memorize unless you know what special cells are in it, what fibers are in it, and what's the stuff that is floating around in. And that's why, if you know the cells and the fiber and the material that is floating around, you can figure out what that tissue actually does. Um, that's where organs and organ systems from the first chapter of your anatomy and physiology books usually comes into play. If you skip past that first chapter, if you skip past cells, um, if you skip past the basics of anatomy and physiology, then this chapter is Hades, right? It's terrible because you don't know what cells do, and you don't know why they're important, and you don't know why they make stuff. And it makes no sense as to what the cells are floating in. So you never grasp the function. And then this chapter ends up like plaguing you for the rest of your class, because you don't get away from connective tissue. Connective tissue, you're going to have entire chapters on specific types of connective tissue. So if you don't get this now, I'm warning you, it comes back to haunt you. Take it from a person who was the type of student who just memorized their way through this and ignored this material in a lot of my science classes. And I would be struggling in the second half of these classes and in my advanced classes because I didn't get these basic concepts. It used to just destroy me later. So go ahead and get this down now, right? Even if you don't have time to memorize this, just write this down and just pull it out and use it when you get into your later information so that you can refer back to it. If you look at a tissue and you're like, I don't understand what the heck they're talking about, it might be because of this one simple basic concept. Now, the third group of tissues is muscular tissue. This is a lot easier to run through because muscular tissue only has three different types. And muscular tissue basically has three roles. It's either going to move your heart, or move the internal organs. I mean, that's pretty much it. Now, of course, you can get into chapters and you get into functions that get into more details, like the fact that skeletal muscle provides heat and all this other stuff. Yeah, that's great. But for right now, I'm just talking about the essential top notch functions that we're going with right now. And the claim to fame for muscular tissue is the fact that it can provide movement because it's the only tissue that provides movement. Every other tissue cannot move on its own. This tissue, you can send the signal to it and it will move. So it's either going to move you because it's attached to your skeletal system and it moves you. It moves your heart, which allows your heart to beat and pump blood, or it moves the internal organs because specifically hollow internal organs have something in it and you need to move things around in it. So when we start talking about where these tissues appear, um, the muscle tissue known as skeletal muscle tissue, when you look at its cells, the cells are long and cylindrical and they're in little bundles and they pull in a particular direction, right? And that's because they are all attached to one end of a bone and then they pull on that bone. And then when that bone moves, you move just like that. I call that the law of Ludacris. So for any of y'all who know about the rapper Ludacris, um, if you know him personally, tell him to get at me. I'd love to put down an anatomy and physiology track with him. But the law of Ludacris states that when skeletal muscle contracts, it moves a bone. And when the bone moves, you move just like that. right? So that's the law of ludicrous. So skeletal muscle, when you look at its cells, they're long, cylindrical, and in bunches, and they pull in a particular direction, right? Cardiac muscle tissue is short. It's not long. It's short, and they're forked, and they're branched, and they look like a bunch of little, weird little branches sticking out that interconnected at the ends, and they squeeze. And the reason why that's important is because this is found in the heart. And so when it squeezes, you take your hand and you squeeze your hand like this. It's squeezing, so it's squeezing blood, and the blood ejects from the areas of the heart and then goes into the rest of the body. And then smooth muscle is flat. It's flat. It doesn't have a lot of distinctions to it. It doesn't have the same lines and patterns on it as skeletal and cardiac muscle do. And the reason why is because it doesn't have some of the same structures, intracellular structures within it. So because it's set up a little differently on the inside of it, it appears flat with no real physical distinctions. And what it does is it pushes substances through hollow organs, and it also mixes substances within hollow organs. So you find smooth muscle in places like your stomach, where it's going to churn and mix food around while you're digesting it, and then ultimately open up on one end and squeeze that food out. And then the last tissue is nervous tissue. And there's not a lot to say about nervous tissue at this point because there's too much to say about nervous tissue at this point. Nervous tissue gets its own chapters in anatomy and physiology classes because there's so much to learn about the nervous system. So, for now, just understand that nervous tissue is an electrical grid. That's why when you look at slides of nervous tissue and why it's on the exams, that it usually comes in like one or two pictures and that's it. There's nothing significant to see in it. That's because it's an electrical grid. You're talking about countless cells, who their sole purpose is to set up an electrical grid so that you can send signals, receive stimuli, and process information. It's a CPU. It's a it's an internal computer. So, and it's made up of these functional cells called neurons. And these neurons typically, a stereotypical neuron that you see in a textbook looks kind of like that. So if you see anything that looks like this in the picture, that's a neuron, that's a nerve cell. And they're scattered throughout the image usually. And you can see them and you're like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And then you go on about your business. Um, but that's because there's so much to say about nervous tissue, and we don't have time to really go into that here. So just keep in mind that when you see that one picture with that weird squiggly line and that weird cell with spikes all over his head, that's a nerve cell. That's a neuron. And that neuron is working in a capacity that you haven't probably covered yet because you're going to get into details about nerve tissue and you're going to talk about how it processes information. So that's a really quick and dirty about the four um, tissue types and how to compartmentalize this information, so that you can memorize it and remember it for exams and for how you're going to be able to complete material in your classes. Talk to you later.